Welcome to our Identifying Trends mini tutorial to get you ready for your assessment. Today we're going to be talking about trends. And so we need to know what a trend actually is. So this is going to be our definition, our working definition that we're going to use for our class. A trend, and I'm going to go ahead and highlight this, and you should write down this definition on your paper, shows relationships between data, so relationships between data that reveal some sort of pattern that occurs over time. Now, typically, we're going to be using line graphs when we're trying to analyze whether or not there are any trends or patterns in data, but you should also know that it's possible to use bar graphs. So it's possible to use either a line graph or a bar graph. The first thing that we want you to know is that there's a specific thing that you should do whenever you're looking at a graph in general. To look at the graph as a whole and to see whether or not you can describe the general shape and direction of the lines that you see. So we're going to look at the general shape of our line graph or our bar graph, and we're also going to ask ourselves whether or not we can make a determination on the direction or directions if there's more than one set of data being represented on the graph of the line or lines, depending on the type of data that's being shown and how much data is being shown within that graph. With that said, there are specific types of patterns that you're going to be responsible for looking for or knowing when we're actually doing our laboratory or when you're actually taking your assessment. So let's talk about the general patterns that you might see. So in general, there are different types of patterns or trends. The first one could be something known as a linear trend. Okay? And with a linear trend, all we're talking about is we're looking for either general increases or decreases in terms of the flow of the line as we move from one side of the graph to another. So here would be an example. If I draw my axis here, if I was looking at data and it was trending this way, or if I was looking at a graph and the line looked like this, or if it was increasing, this is an example of a linear trend. On the flip side, we could also have a linear trend that's moving in the opposite direction, that's moving this way, so it's decreasing. So linear trends can either be increasing or they can be decreasing. And another type of trend that you might see in the future is something called a non-linear trend. And nonlinear trends are pretty common because data rarely looks this good. It rarely looks this pretty. So a nonlinear trend shows data that's moving in both an up and down fashion. So if I were to graph what a nonlinear trend would look like, it could look something like this. Okay, so it's both increasing and decreasing depending on what part of the graph we're actually looking at. And then finally, the last pattern that you need to be comfortable with identifying is something called a pattern that's referred to as no trend. And if there's no trend, that basically means that you can't find any portion of the graph that's increasing or decreasing or in a logical fashion that makes sense or is easy for the eye to see. And the way that this would look, if this is my graph, you would see data points kind of all over the place. So they're hard to actually make sense of because they're not following any sensical pattern. Now you might be asking yourselves, well, what's the point of even looking for trends when we're looking at graphs? And that's an excellent question. The reason why trends are so important when we're looking at graph data is because trends allow us to make predictions about data. And predictions are really important because sometimes we only have a fixed amount of data, and so we don't have any data for something that might happen in the future, but we want to be prepared for what we may or may not see. And if there's an overall trend in the data and that we can make the assumption that that trend will continue in the future, it allows us to predict how much of something or how often something might happen depending on the type of data that we're actually collecting. Last thing that we want to talk about really quickly here before we wrap up talking about trends and overall patterns when we're looking at graphs is that oftentimes on a test or a quiz, we're going to ask you some very specific questions about increases or decreases on certain parts of a graph. So for instance, if we give you a graph, and I'm going to just draw it here because I have some space. If we give you a graph that looks something like this, and we have specific data points in different locations along the graph that allowed us to create the best fit line that you see, we might ask you on a quiz or on a test to tell us about a specific portion of the graph. So if we're asking you, for instance, if our IV is time, and we're moving in this direction, if we asked you about a specific time that was along that graph, along the x-axis, to tell us what the general pattern or trend is, we might only be asking you, depending on the question, about this portion of the graph. And if that's all we're asking you about, we want you to pretend that this portion of the graph doesn't exist. Or if we're asking you about a specific time, and maybe this happens to be days, and we're only asking you about 3 specific days, and those 3 specific days happen to fall in between these two vertical dashed lines, again, we're only asking you to tell us about this small portion of the graph in reference to what trend you see. So you want to be really careful when you're reading the question to figure out what we're actually asking you and what part of the graph we're asking you to actually analyze to answer that specific question. All right, good luck, guys. Be sure to call us over if you need additional help or stop by before the assessment. We'd love to give you one last set of practice problems or to just talk to you in general to make sure that you feel confident going into the assessment.